Great. Andy, are we all in now? Okay. Hi, everyone. Is everyone here? Ivor?
Yeah. I'm here.
Okay. We'll just give it a few minutes. We've got about 40 people joining in, so we'll just give it maybe another minute or so to see, and then we'll start.
Perfect. Yeah.
Okay. Who's not here is from COSATU. I don't see anyone from COSATU just yet. Ivor?
Yeah, Palesa, we just waiting for Tumaleng. He didn't receive the link, so we're sending him a new link, and he'll join us ASAP. But I think I don't think there's any reason not to get going.
Okay, cool. Let's just get going. Thank you everyone for coming to this roundtable discussion, fast-tracking public service reform. It is so good to be here with you. The roundtable is organized by Government and Public Policy, a research institute led by Professor Ivor Chipkin. My name is Palesa Murudu, and I will be facilitating the discussion this afternoon. We're going to spend about 2 hours together, and we will be hearing from leaders of civil society, business, and the private sector on what needs to be done to support public sector reforms in South Africa. As many of you know, a couple of weeks ago, GAB convened a conference on this subject, where the Minister of Public Services, Senzo Mchunu, gave a keynote address. The conference was attended by senior civil servants. Some leaders of business and civil society also spoke at the conference. Today's session really is about understanding what it would take to build support for public sector reforms from labor, business, and civil society. Before we get into this discussion, I would first like to explain how the program will unfold, and thereafter I will take a few minutes to provide some broader context to really help us frame and better understand this issue of public sector reform. With regard to the program, we will start with Professor Anthony Butler, who is a professor of politics at the University of Cape Town. He will give us a high-level summary of the public sector reform agenda that emerged from the conference that took place a couple of weeks ago, as I mentioned earlier. And after that, I will then pose some questions to our panel. I will introduce them to you as I ask them questions individually. I will also take questions in the chat room or directly if people want to verbalize their questions. There's a little icon there. You can raise your hand or you can just put your question in the chat box. At the end of it all, I will ask Professor Chipkin to close the discussion with how he sees the process moving forward. Now for context. It is important to keep this context in mind as we discuss this afternoon, because I want to believe that public sector reform is more than just professionalizing the public service and or addressing the public sector wage bill. It is really about understanding why it is that we are in the situation we find ourselves today, the opportunity we have to self-correct, and what must be done to never ever find ourselves staring down the abyss like we have been for some time now. As I was preparing for this conversation this afternoon, I found a paper written by some of our very clever compatriots. Maybe I'll call them some top thinkers. Their names are Brian Levy, who's a professor of economics, I think, at the Johns Hopkins University. Professor Alan Hirsch and Professor Vinathan Naidu, who are both at the University of Cape Town, and Musa Ngcele, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Nelson Mandela in the Eastern Cape. Their paper is entitled South Africa, When Strong Institutions and Massive Inequalities Collide. They wrote the paper for the Carnegie Endowment International Peace, and it was published in March this year. So it's quite fresh. I'm going to read some bits of it from the summary of the paper. This is how they begin. They say South Africa was one of the 1990s iconic cases of democratization. Yet starting in the mid-2000s, the country began to experience a disruptive collision between its strong political institutions and massive economic inequality. The collision intensified across the 2010s, resulting in economic stagnation and increasing threats to institutional integrity. They argue that ideally, ideas, institutions, and growth all reinforce one another in a developmental spiral. Ideas offer hope by encouraging cooperation and the pursuit of opportunities for win-win gains. Institutions assure that the bargains underpinning cooperation will be monitored and reinforced. Together, ideas and institutions provide credible commitment which fuels economic growth. That is essentially their hypothesis. For the first 15 years, they argue, South Africa enjoyed the advantages of both effective institutions and a shared willingness of stakeholders to believe in the power of cooperation. This enabled the country to move beyond counterproductive conflict and pursue win-win outcomes. Growth began to accelerate, which created new opportunities for expanding the middle class. Increased fiscal space made it possible to broaden access to public services and to social grants, which reduced absolute poverty. So they argue that South Africa's political settlement was built around 4 distinct sub-bargains. Number one, a deal between the overwhelming white economic elite and the country's new political leadership. This included commitments to the rule of law, including protection of private property, and to economic transformation, including through Black economic empowerment and Black economic empowerment program. Call that CODESA if you want to. That's what I say. Secondly, a deal among the new political elites within the majority political party, which is the African National Congress. We all know that the ANC is a broad tent encompassing many ideological proclivities, degrees of public spiritedness, and regional, ethnic, and economic interests. Its implicit promise was that its formal structures plus structures of government would channel this diversity towards a shared national purpose. A promise of upward mobility. One aspect was a commitment to protect the interests of the new, predominantly Black middle class insiders. Another aspect was a promise that a combination of education, job creation, and an end to racial discrimination would open up readily accessible opportunities for those on the cusp of middle class status. And lastly, they argue that a promise to reduce extreme poverty through minority rule, redirection of public resources and services. Pretty much they're talking about 4 things. Number 1 was the CODESA agreement or consensus. Number 2 was catered deployment by the ANC. Number 3 was pretty much affirmative action. And number 4 was the grants. So that was the basis of South Africa's settlement. They argue that all of these sub-bargains, except for the last one, which was pursued at least into the 2010s, were built on shaky foundations. Pressures on institutions were building. Many BEE transactions straddled the boundaries between rules-based and more personalized deal-making. Who should participate in BEE initiatives became part of the ANC inter-elite conflict. Adapting to a transformed political order created new pressures for the public sector. And I think that's important for the purposes of our conversation this afternoon. So they continue to argue that had South Africa been able to enjoy a combination of visionary leadership and East Asian rates of rapid economic growth for a sustained period, the expansion of opportunity throughout society might have trumped the limitations of the aspirational commitments. In reality, the country only briefly reached an annual rate of 5% from 2005 to 2008. In 2009, former President Jacob Zuma became president. Over the course of the subsequent 8 years, a downward spiral of decline seemed to take hold. What then happened was the upper echelons of the African National Congress competed for control over resources and positions of influence, further ratcheting up pressure on institutions. After 2009, state-owned enterprises emerged as especially lucrative area for powerful and well-connected individuals and factions to engage in systemic looting. In Zuma's second term, they argue per capita income growth entered negative territory. Zero-sum contestation over positions and resources at the national, provincial, and local levels became acute. A rising tide of disillusion across society further undermined the political settlement. The losers in the elite conflicts within the ANC felt aggrieved. Those on the cusp of the formal economy found themselves unable to consolidate their middle-class status. Job creation in the formal sector was anemic, unemployment steadily increased. So what happened is disillusion led into anger, fueled by both genuine grievance and political opportunism. In the face of limited opportunity, an increasing number of South Africans came to see privilege enjoyed by the mostly white economic elite and the tide of apparent corruption that seemed to be the only way that new elites could share in that privilege as a provocation. In turn, opportunistic ethno-populist political entrepreneurs, that's who they call them, sought to use disillusion to strengthen their position within inter-elite political struggles. So all the elements seem to be in place for a rapidly accelerating cumulative slide with weakened economic performance, institutional decay, and anger and ethno-populism feeding on one another. So they argue that while the December 2017 election of Cyril Ramaphosa as leader of the ANC and his subsequent accession to the country's presidency signaled a pause to the slide, 3 years later, the country is not out of the woods. Ramaphosa has not been able to move decisively beyond a promise to stop the rot and to also offer a renewed positive vision. The country's deep-seated underlying challenges remain exacerbated by the economic consequences of the coronavirus pandemic. So they're posing some very serious questions to us. They say, how do we maintain a positive social, political, and economic trajectory in the face of high or rising inequality? Number one, they say the trajectory of change is a knife edge. And I want to argue that that's where we're finding ourselves in South Africa today, on a knife edge. There's potential to create virtuous cycles of positive interactions among ideas, institutions, and economic growth. That for me is on the positive side. But there's also is a substantial risk that unaddressed distributional imbalances could cause a cumulative downward spiral of decline. They argue, number two, that ideas matter, and of course ideas matter. A hopeful vision of change, when combined with a good enough responsiveness to distributional concerns, can be sufficient to launch a positive trajectory. Number three, they argue that both ideas and institutions can be shields against adversity, but only up to a point. Hopeful ideas can evoke positive agency and help mobilize people to collective action. Institutions can function as shock absorbers. However, both ideas and institutions need reinforcement, including by addressing festering imbalances in economic and political power. Lastly, they argue that initiating a new cycle of renewal requires a set of ideas and actions that address in a good enough way the imbalances resulting from derailment. So what is most important is credible promise of upward mobility. We should both offer rapid gains for those on the cusp of the middle class and a vision of hope and possibility across society as a whole. They lastly say South Africa's leaders need to mobilize new coalitions capable of overcoming the vested interests that stifle inclusive change. And the question really is the fundamental one is, can South Africa's leadership summon the necessary boldness to rise to this challenge? And at this point, I really want to put that question to Professor Anthony Butler to see if the conference that took place a couple of weeks ago does go in any way to answering this fundamental question that is put in the paper. Can South Africa's leadership summon the necessary boldness to rise to this challenge in relation to public sector reforms? Professor Butler, it's over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Palesa, for starting me off with such a difficult question. I think that what I want to do first is to summarize the responses of the people at the conference on 28th and 29th of April, what they said about the key challenges facing the government and the rest of society with regard to public sector reform. And I think that many of those comments started from the same place that you've done with this paper from Levy and Hirsch and Naidu, and that public sector reform takes place in a political context, and that political context is enormously complex, and it shapes the incentives and opportunities that are available to governments and to political leaders. And I think that one way to start, as we started the conference, was with the political principles. And among the people who spoke at the conference were the minister, Senzo Mkhunu, one of his predecessors, Geraldine Fraser-Moleketi from the early 2000s, and also some of the public servants who are leading major politically sensitive reforms today, including the head of the National School of Government and the SARS commissioner. And I think the minister began by observing that we can't ever forget the political context. So the political context is at the center of the minds of policy reformers in the ANC. And of course, the political context has a lot of dimensions. Some of them are internal to the ANC itself. Others concern the wider society. And as you rightly have drawn our attention to, the patterns of persisting inequality and injustice in the society. Where we began with the conference was with a slightly more narrowly focused objective, which was to respond and build on the new framework, which I have to read it because it's difficult to remember, the National Implementation Framework for the Professionalization of the Public Service. So this is supposed to be a set of key practical steps for changing how the public service functions with regard to all of the constraints that our political and administrative environment places in the way of those reforms. And I think there the minister began with a diagnosis where he said some positive and some negative things about the current public service. More negative than positive, but he disagreed that the public service was bloated, a phrase that's often used, partly I think on the basis of internal research by government, attempts by the government to understand itself in comparative perspective. So we have more or less as many public servants as we might expect. One of the big problems is that we do have a really serious problem with the public service wage bill. that does need to be addressed. And he described that as having grown to almost uncontrollable levels. And he also observed that paying high salaries appears to be to have no impact on reducing corruption. So one argument that's sometimes made is you have to pay high salaries to reduce incentives to corruption. The minister himself said that that hasn't worked. And then he talked about the fact that so many public servants, he said, more than a third of public servants are not qualified for the positions that they hold. And one of the elements of the reform program is going to be, he described it as confronting people who are not properly qualified for their jobs, asking them how they got those jobs. And that's supposed to be part of a broader interrogation of public servants' qualifications, how they're appointed, why they're appointed. Although, as some participants noted, there wasn't very much detail about how that would happen in practice. But the minister placed this professionalization framework. He said it's at the center of what they're trying to do, and it's an important starting point, that we need public servants to be professionals in some sense. The head of the National School of Government, Busani Mkhweni, he detailed that professionalization framework. And I'm not trying to evade your question, Palesa, but I'll come to the politicization issue in just a moment, and the broader political context. But the principal of the National School of Government detailed a set of changes that they're proposing to make to the way in which the public service functioned. And those include changes to selection processes, including the introduction of exams, changes to performance management systems, more professional development and continuing learning, and then some reforms that are to do with turning the public service into more of a set of institutions that provide a career for people. So beginning with extending the tenure of people like DGs and deputy DGs, and then ultimately looking to have permanent senior public sector officials, people whose whole career is in the public service. And one part of this change to the character of the senior public service concerns how people are recruited and appointed. And there's some attempt to give a new role to the Public Service Commission in the appointment and recruitment processes and perhaps promotion processes, so that there's some body that is less politically implicated in the everyday politics of the society, to give that a much more important role in appointments. So although that was only a starting point, the professionalization framework, that was really our point of departure. When we moved into the conference itself, people commented on that, but they also addressed a lot of these wider issues that you've raised about the broader context of the society. And I think there were four main categories under which I would place the contributions. And apologies here, I was asked to summarize the discussion relatively briefly, and there were so many interesting contributions that I will have left out many of them in this summary. But the four main areas I think concern politics and politicization. And the second one concerned institutions, which the paper that you introduced us to, Palesa, also raised. And the third one was to do with oversight and accountability, particularly when it comes to procurement. And the fourth one was about the process of reform itself. So if it's so, shall I just continue and summarize quickly what people said in those areas?
Just quickly, Anthony, if you can, yeah.
Okay. In the first area about politicization, some people question whether the framework had really tackled this issue. So there was some ambivalence about whether a professional political service, professional public service is political and in what ways. And some participants said you can't avoid politicization, particularly at senior levels of the public service.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, this raises issues that the president also raised at the Zondo Commission about whether you can in fact have a politically neutral public service at all. And most people would agree you can't. But what clearly we don't have is mechanisms for making political appointments transparent. What we have is we have de facto politicization. People are appointed for political reasons. And because it's not transparent and it's not properly regulated, often those supposedly political appointments are something else. So they're connected to cronyism and nepotism and so on. So because we can't avoid politics in the framework of the public service, we need to be clearer about which are the properly political positions. How transparently can we make those appointments? Okay, and I think that partly the response from the framework is that the Public Service Commission will somehow act in an apolitical way in appointments. But many people have suggested that once you give that kind of power to the Public Service Commission or to a new head of the public service, immediately that body and that individual become important political actors, and they themselves will become politicized. So that's a problem that's difficult to resolve, and that I think people weren't convinced it was resolved in the document. The second one is to do with institution building. And there I think there was a general sense that the ANC had completely miscalculated why institutions matter. That when, and perhaps partly understandably so, so when the ANC came to power, we had in essence, we had a regime change, and the inheritance of a public sector bureaucracy that could be reasonably seen as hostile to change. And so there was a need for both some kind of strategy of deployment, some kind of strategy for political appointments, where political was understood in a general sense as being bringing about a change towards the objectives embodied in the new constitutional order. And perhaps, on the part of the ANC, clearly something beyond that, something to do with deployments that helped further the longer-term objectives of the ANC itself. But there have been many consequences of that have, over time, started to outweigh the benefits. And we're now a long way from the situation in 1994. And that suggests that we now need to move rapidly away from the conception of the public service as an instrument, and to view it more as a creation of a set of institutions that are resistant to interference by politicians and by special interests. So that is an important and really valuable part of the professionalization framework that governments put forward, that there's clearly an awareness there that the time has arrived, for sure, for building more stable institutions that are rule governed. I think there were also many comments that many of the proposals were very general, so they dealt with this thing called a public servant, but most public servants are actually they spend their entire career in a sector. So they might be a teacher or an administrator of education, they might be in the health service, they might be in the police. And the professionalization framework doesn't fully take account of that. So it talks about professionalization as building links between public servants and professional bodies and so on, but without very much detail. It's mostly rather general about what a professional public servant looks like. So that's the institutions. The third main area was about accountability and oversight, particularly when it comes to procurement and money. So money is obviously the big issue. And here there was a lot of disagreement, I think. I mean, clearly there were people, including a current Treasury official who was very adamant we needed a harder line, including taking steps like criminalizing unexplained wealth and making open the revenue service records of politicians, including the president. So doing away with tax transparency. And also introducing a whole range of new measures in bodies like SOEs, including the appointment of directors that are entirely independent of the stakeholder, the state. So there's been that's one of the perspectives that to some extent was also criticized, that we've had a focus on cracking down on corruption, cracking down on abuses of process. We've ended up in the public service with a really strong compliance tick box culture, where everyone is mistrusted, everyone has to follow rules that in fact can't be followed. And the only people who are able to negotiate their way through the rules that we have are the crooks. So the rules don't seem to stop the corruption, but they stop ordinary public servants who are mostly well motivated from doing their jobs. So they paralyze the system. And that was something that came up in the SARS Commissioner's contribution as well, when thinking about both his own organization and about taxpayers. And he said, you can't start with a model that everyone is trying to get out of paying taxes. You have to start with a model of encouraging people to comply. And you have to draw on the enthusiasms and capacities of the people you employ in a state institution, rather than to assume that they are all trying to undermine the institution. And that's a really important point that maybe in this fourth section I could come back to. So the fourth broad area was the process of reform itself. And here we had several really interesting contributions. One that I particularly want to focus on is one from Dr. Bill Thompson from the OECD, who is responsible for the OECD's operations in Eurasia, a very wide area. And he's worked a lot on public sector reform in countries that are very different to South Africa in many ways. But so many of the things that he said struck home. And I think the problems of corruption in many Central Asian republics, for example, are far, far worse than ours in South Africa. And the state institutions are far more vulnerable. But nevertheless, there were many echoes. And I think some of the important points he raised, one of them was that you need to be persistent to get public sector reform to work. So you can't expect to introduce a new framework of reform that will suddenly work, that will suddenly change the behavior of public servants and institutions, partly because of the complexity of those institutions, partly because there is, how do we describe it, a path dependency, a lock-in of sets of practices within institutions. It's very hard to change how people are behaving. And it's also hard to know if what you're doing is working. So it's very hard to actually evaluate whether public sector reforms are producing better outcomes. So it's difficult to do, and usually public sector reform works over quite a long period of time if people stick at it. So they try to introduce reforms. They usually don't all take, or usually all of them don't take, but you stick at it and opportunities will arise for people to adopt the practices that you're proposing over time. And a second key element of that is that you need to have support from people who are involved, and particularly from public servants themselves. So public servants, often I think, civil society organizations that are tired of corruption, trade unions that are tired of workers being blamed for problems in the public service, they end up with a very negative conception of public servants. And in fact, most public servants can be won round to a process of reform. And in fact, they often have ideas for how reforms can be undertaken. So it's necessary to get them to buy into the process and to be a part of it. And that applies to the other actors as well, including there are clearly certain businesses that might be concerned about how their relationships with the state might be disrupted by changes to procurement policies and accountability. There might be trade unions that are nervous about what a state reform process means for their members. But in a sense, the focus has to be on where the problem is. And the problem isn't with public servants in general. The problem is with I think more than anything else, with a political elite that knows what is happening in the public service, is broadly complicit in it, but doesn't view reform as either easy or less damaging to themselves than no reform. So to bring about reform, you need to exert pressure. And that pressure has to come from lots of directions on the political elite in your society. It has to come from business, from investors, from trade unions, and also from broader citizen bodies who need to make the cost of not cleaning up the public service, making it work in the interests of ordinary citizens. It has to make those costs real to push them into reform. And that requires a broader coalition to work together towards this project.
Great.
Can I leave it there, Palesa?
Yeah, I think that's a good point to leave it at, Anthony. Thank you so much for that. I think it brings me to the next point of some questions to the panel, and I'm going to start with Bishop A.B. Mpulwana, who actually has to leave in about 10 or 15 minutes. And my question really to Bishop Mpulwana is, having heard what Anthony had to say, and also given the fact that, for a very long time, the churches, and in particular led by the South African Council of Churches, has focused pretty much primarily on corruption in South Africa, which is important to focus on. But I wanted to get a sense from you, Bishop Mpulwana, whether is it now time to change a little bit of focus to still focus on corruption, but to broaden this, and how would you see that in relation to the public sector reform? And given the fact that, Anthony was really talking about how do you then put pressure on political pressure or social pressure on political actors to make sure that we can ensure that we professionalize the public service. I want to get a sense from you in reaction to that, Bishop Mpulwana.
Thank you, Palesa. Thank you for having me. I'm actually quite excited by these conversations, and I hope that it's not a one-off, but it's a commitment to a process, especially because To answer your first question about political will,
oh no.
Aspect.
Did we? Okay.
Have you lost me?
No, just for a second, but go ahead. We can hear you now.
Yeah. And so anyway, I think that the time is right. South Africans are tired of maladministration. People look at the national scene, and I tell you, it is frightening at the community level. The South African Council of Churches that I represent has done two things that I think might be worth mentioning here, because I would like those to be part of the conversation at some point. One is that having seen the plague of corruption, we then looked at what seems to be the failure of South Africa to achieve the promise of the post-apartheid South Africa. And it's very broad. It's not just about the civil service. It's about the fact that we are not even one common society. I mean, there's no such a thing as common South African-ness. We just happen to reside in the same geographic space, but everybody is for themselves. And we have not taken the trouble to build a common citizenship, out of which you then draw a civil service and a political process that has the country ahead of individual, ethnic, and sectional interests. And that is why we have some of the problems we have, but that's for another conversation. But as part of that, we identified 4 things that we thought were necessary to make for the promise of the post-apartheid South Africa. One of these was healing and reconciliation. The things that you talked about at the beginning from those authors that made it necessary to have that kind of agreement, if you like, had to do with the fact that we had a healing and reconciliation that needed to be done, but we actually didn't invest in that. And so we remain with the same generational woundedness that makes everybody fend for themselves. It doesn't matter how corrupt or looting you can be. Secondly, and of course, this also goes with the whole issue of the difficulty of family life in our society. The second thing was what we call economic transformation that deals in a focused way with poverty and inequality. And that you don't deal with that only as they did at the beginning of democracy through social grants, because that's not sustainable. It does mean there has to be a deliberate process to bring what I call the excluded majority into the economic participation. When I say excluded majority, I mean the colors and Africans in South Africa. Between the two of them, they make up 99% of the poverty, and they make up 90% of the voting population. And that therefore means it's a serious problem. And I talk about the Bantustans, I talk about the country's platteland towns, and I talk about the squatter camps. All of these mean that we have to deal with this in a meaningful way in terms of economic transformation, not about tenders and BEE. Thirdly, it is comprehensive quality education that begins at the beginning, because the intellectual development of human beings begins and ends, some suggest, by age 9. If you have not created the capacity at age 9, you live with what you've got. And that means the bulk of poor communities that don't have the capacity to stimulate their children up to age 9 will always be on the wrong end of the stick. And so that is why, therefore, comprehensive quality education is not only about fees must fall, but it's also about those that cannot toy at age 3. And the fourth one is therefore, this is where we began to talk about the civil service and governance, the integrity thereof. In this regard, our civil society manifesto, which developed as a result of this 18 months process of thinking together, led by the churches and civil society, suggested that, and I heard this said earlier, that it is not possible to separate, to do away with political cadre deployment or political appointments. We believe it is possible, and that if everything must be institutionalized, and that if you say at this level of employment, a minister will come with these people that they appoint, or the president will come, any politician is entitled to this number of this level of appointment. Everyone else does not belong to the politician or the political parties, but belongs to a very rigorous system of training and recruiting. And that is managed by a totally independent, that commission, whatever they call it, Public Service Commission. And that now, if this is possible, if you go back to Professor Stan Sangweni, who was our first Public Service Commission head, and he said this in no uncertain terms in one of our meetings, that at the beginning, he and Dr. Skweyi, who was the minister at the time, traveled the world and went to the Eastern countries that we have referenced to look at how to make for reliable, permanent civil servants. And they came back and said, we think civil servants should have a 20-year contract and they can leave, but they must not be expected to move out in less than 20 years if they still have, so that they can then become part of the furniture, and that any minister coming will be briefed by these people. How do we do business around here? The minister doesn't come and say, here's what I've come to do, ship out if you don't like it, which is what is happening today. And now I want to end by saying that what would be calling for is the institutionalization of the contracts of civil servants that are professionalized in a manner that makes the Constitution provision in Chapter 10 come alive. There is a provision for good governance in Chapter 10 of our Constitution that must come alive. And I would, if I had the time, I would have shared with you, and I'll probably send it, for posting later, that Professor Sangweni at that time, I call this the Sangweni Code of Governance, that all executive members, employees of public service, board members, and officials of public enterprises should actually take an oath that they will pledge these things. I pledge my loyalty and allegiance to the Constitution of the Republic. I shall at all times. I mean, it's a beautiful statement, and I'm going to share that with you. I'll send it to Ivo. But it really, what I'm really saying here is that if we are going to seriously pull the civil service away from the quagmire of personal interests, we have to make sure that the only document that protects us, the Constitution, must come alive in the lives of civil servants. And therefore, in that context, be able to say, at this level, Mr. Minister, Madam Minister, you have your friends. But from here on, it's our friends, not yours.
Fantastic. Thank you. I hope we can get to that point at some point. I'm going to bring in the Black Business Council into the conversation now. Kangi Matabane is the CEO of the Black Business Council. Tangi, what we hear mostly from established business in South Africa when it comes to public service is mostly around the wage bill. From Black business, in many cases, around procurement. And I want to ask you a question: how does the public service reform align with your interest as business, from arresting the ballooning public sector wage bill and your interest in procurement? How does what is being proposed, the framework, align with your interests? That's the first question, and I'll come to a few more after that.
Thank you very much, Palesa and Ivo, for the invitation. Maybe let me start with where the man of the cloth ended, and then talk about the capacity of the state. So, if you look at the Auditor General's report, it will show and indicate to you that the Western Cape SOCs, or state-owned enterprises, are receiving clean audits, and then when they did the analysis to check why, is because there has been stability in the SOCs. You find the CEO, specifically the CEO and the CFO, will have been there for 10, 15 years, because then they understand the environment. They understand what needs to be done, and then how to do things. And when new employees come, they're able to tell them these are things, how things are done. When the new board comes, they are able to tell them because they've got institutional memory, which then indicate that even in government, because in the past 9 years or so, we have seen so much instability. That is, in any way, it has contributed towards the attaining of not so clean audits. Because you have a DG, they're there for 2 years. After that, they leave. There's another one who's acting, and then you know when people are acting, they are reluctant to take decisions. So they're getting unclean audits. But they are also not able to implement anything. So part of the capacity of the state, which is one of the things that we spoke about during the discussions at NETLEC on the economic recovery and reconstruction, is that the capacity of the state is very, very important. So it's very, very important because whatever gets decided and decided by the party that is ruling at any stage, the state won't be able to implement because there's no capacity. And I think that's what probably the president has been trying to do since he was appointed president. Unfortunately, COVID was not necessarily the development around COVID was not necessarily helpful to what he was trying to do. But I think what I want to emphasize is that we need to. I support the previous speaker that we need to have long-term tenure of senior public servants, the DGs, the CEOs of state-owned enterprises, because you have a CEO of a state-owned enterprise is given 5 years. The first year, they're trying to learn the business. Second and third year and fourth year, they're trying to deliver. Fourth year, they are looking for a job. So you can see that's why service delivery is not happening because we have so much instability.
Sorry, Tangi, before you go ahead, I mean, there is also the thing around business attracting top civil servants, and therefore, and it's been practiced for a very long time in South Africa that you poach from the civil sector to go into business, with much more promising, lucrative opportunities as compared to the public sector. So, I mean, how do you square the two where business is able to poach from the civil service at the same time as, as you say and correctly say, and what Bishop Kumlwana says, that you need longevity in the civil service so that you can have a much more, you can have sustainability, you can have longevity in the public service. How do you square the two? Because business is the one that poaches from the civil service.
Yeah, I think that is not necessarily a bad thing. If there's interchangeability between public servants and private sector employees, it's a good thing because then you are able to take someone from the public sector who will then go and understand how the private sector works and then vice versa. But what we've seen is that a lot of, firstly, I think that there should be a review of salaries of the certain departments. For example, a DG of National Treasury, the money that they are earning is not, if you look at that and the Department of Sports, for example, the responsibilities are not the same. But now because government has decided all the DGs will earn so much, you have that type of a situation where someone who's got serious responsibilities earns the same amount of money with someone who does not necessarily have the same responsibility. So I think there's a need for that review. But what we've realized is that because of how especially Black professionals are treated in public sector, most of them are also reluctant to join the public sector. That's why you find that municipalities are the way they are, because the mistreatment of professionals is even more prevalent in smaller provinces where the public sector is the 80%, 90% employer in that province. So smaller provinces like Eastern Cape, Limpopo, Mpumalanga, Northwest, you'll find that a CFO is someone who was an English teacher, because the CAs who are here are reluctant to go there because they get mistreated by people who are not necessarily even qualified than them. And then the way also, if for example they disagree and they have to leave and resign, when you are in public sector, you are likely to tarnish your name forever of the way the separation process is handled. Your name will be in the newspapers, you'll be all over the places, and then you are not able to proceed later in life and continue with your career. Unlike in private sector. In private sector, when you differ, you have an agreement, and then they say you're pursuing your own your own interest, and at least you still have a career after that. So if you want to encourage the professionals, especially black professionals, to go to public sector, we need to do away with interference. So if we agree on the tenure to say people get appointed for a longer period, that will deal with the interference, and then also then do like the President Ramaphosa has done, take the powers of firing DGs from the ministers, and then concentrate those in the president. So if that can be done in the municipalities, in the provinces, I think that will help and deal with the political interference, because someone comes there and then they think they know better than you, and then that's why some of the professionals, they end up telling the politicians what the politicians want to hear, not necessarily what is the truth. And that one cannot help us if you want to build a professional public service. And then I think the other issue is some people confuse the issue of corruption and transformation. And those are two different issues. It does not necessarily mean if we are saying we're implementing employment equity, it means we need to hire people who are not qualified. That's not the case. If you read the employment equity, it's very, very clear that you have to have potential, you have to have experience, you have to have qualifications, and then that way you can then be given an opportunity. So I think it's important that whatever happens with the professionalization, we should not do away with the employment equity, because as we know, it's not happening in private sector. 27 years down the line after 1994, we still have a situation where more than 65% of the CEO positions are held by white males, and that is not a sustainable situation, because it means also we are not using the 90% of the population. We're only using 10% of the population to run the entire economy. So if you've got a car that has got 5 cylinders, you're only using 1 cylinder. You are not optimizing on the car. So it's important that we do that. But the tenure of CEOs of SOCs, CFOs of SOCs, the DGs, I think it's very, very important that we must take that into consideration. But also, let's differentiate between the DGs depending on the responsibilities. It cannot be like equal pay. Like if you say all the companies in the mining sector must pay 10,000 rand per month, it's not going to happen, because other people then will go to other countries where they'll be paid more because of their skills.
Yeah, that's going to be a tough one. Let's see where that goes, but it's an interesting one. I'm going to bring in Shan Bolton from the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation. There's an interesting question for you, Shan, from one of the participants here, and I think it's only fair that I give that to you because of your the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation's close association with the ruling party. What Stephen Meach is saying is that reforming the public service in South Africa will be a very complex undertaking in the current political environment. He says we all know that the right thing is but not have little courage to do it. He says the ruling party must reform itself and unbundle the tripartite alliance before it can reform the public service. And I think it's an interesting thing because, you know, if you look at the ANC and its leadership of government since 1994, then you can really see, you know, it depends on the incumbent, what happens with government and the state. You know, there was the Nelson Mandela time, there was the Thabo Mbeki time, there was the Jacob Zuma time. Now we've got the Cyril Ramaphosa time, and then you can really differentiate the 4 stages of what happens and the necessity, the importance of the incumbency. That's number 1. But if we're going to rely on the character and the value system of the incumbency, it's unsustainable because it depends on who comes in, and then they create a culture within the ruling party. And this is based on an assumption that, you know, the ANC will be in power for a very long time because that's who the electorate in South Africa believes that is, you know, able to look after its interest. But what do you say to that? That, you know, is it possible to transform the African National Congress? And I'm asking you simply because of the close relationship that the Katrada and the ruling party has.
Well, no, thank you very much. But the question itself is one that I would want to get altered. Firstly, because we don't have a close relationship with the ruling party. The foundation would consider itself to be non-partisan, not opposed to the ruling party, but also critical of it, and would be one that has challenged it on a whole range of things over the last few years. Whilst its board is chaired by Derek Honeycomb, its founder, Ahmed Kathrada, was very clear that it was not an ANC-aligned institution. So, but I think in general, just a couple of points. I think the notions of depoliticizing the public service is never going to work in a country like South Africa that is so political in almost every aspect of life. I think what we need to be talking about is a non-partisan public service, a public service that doesn't owe its allegiance to a particular party, but that is incredibly skilled in understanding the politics of the country and also of their respective area of work. Because I think if you take health is incredibly politicized, but I don't think many of the people who work in health actually understand the social political dynamics of the kind of work that they do, and therefore the importance of the services that they provide and the political outcomes that should fulfill their own kinds of aspirations. If you viewed it in that kind of non-partisan way. I think just the power of politics, I think the report and the outcome of that conference was very clear, from appointments to just about everything else. The question that we really have to grapple with in a very simple way is what made a lot of this possible, the kinds of things that have been alluded to. Why would an HOD or a DG sign off on things that are irregular and unlawful? And what do we do in order to ensure that they build around them a system that enables them to withstand unlawful and irregular instructions? Because whether it's Life Isidimeni or any of the stuff that's come through Zondo, at the end of the day, for payment to be made in the public service, some accounting officer would have signed off. And I think if we just get down to those basics and ring-fencing the areas that is at the core of a public service, which is administrative work at a very senior management level, and find ways of ensuring that if somebody comes under pressure, whether it's from the political head or whoever, what mechanisms do they have to then say, no, I'm not signing this? What hotline do they have to either the president or to some other entity that says, I'm being asked to do stuff here that is unlawful and I don't want to do it? Now, this was a proposal that we had made to the Gauteng Premier when they were dealing with Life Esidimeni itself. And we said to him, convene a forum of all your senior public servants. And in that forum, just give them the simple message that says, if you come under this pressure, you phone me, and I will then intervene. I don't think it took that forward. But the reform has all the complexity, but there are also simple things that can be done. I think for me, transparency is an answer to a whole range of things. And we saw this with the PPE procurement. The first calls that we made to the president and to others was to make information available on the procurement. Eventually, that information started coming out. Civil society itself, I think in the end, was incredibly weak to start using that kind of information on a more regular and consistent basis. Fortunately, investigative journalists and others have been able to take that forward and start unpacking the nitty-gritty. Now, if that kind of practice is mainstreamed across procurement, whether it's, no matter which government entity is there, that procurement information should be available at all times. And I guarantee you now, you will find this with very few government departments and even state-owned enterprises. You don't know what they had procured, who they procured it for, at what price, and who the service provider was. And if that kind of information is consistently provided, I think it would limit scope for corruption, but would also empower a whole range of people to enhance accountability work. And you know, I just want to conclude that the bishop raised issues about private, the dedicated staff in political offices. That provisions for that exist. If you are an MEC or a premier minister, your private office staff is clearly defined, very poorly monitored, incredibly poorly monitored by the monitoring authorities here. And likewise, I think there are existing mechanisms, poorly enforced, poorly utilized, that would make the kind of renewal of the public service not as onerous as I think it's probably been made out to be. Because this is not an institution that I think can be revolutionized over a day. Lastly, to end off, I think where we need to go to is to start looking at where are the points that you can start turning around the power relations between public servants and citizens. And some of the work that we hope to be doing in the next 2 to 3 years that will start of this year is really developing citizen accountability models. So what would an accountable clinic, police station, school actually look like? How should they be accountable and to who? And what kinds of skills and capacities would citizens need to actually do accountability work? Because we just use the word without understanding that it is in fact hard work to hold a police station accountable. With all the kinds of secrecy that all of that entails. But that kind of work, if done consistently and is spread across the country, I think then begins to turn power relations around and addresses a whole range of the other suggestions that have been made. But I think at its core base level, which would be at the grassroots level. So sorry, I couldn't deal with the issues of the ruling party or the governing party, okay. But just to say that we can't speak for the ANC.
Okay, no, that's fine. I'm going to bring in Kosachi, maybe they will do that. I'm going to bring Itumeleng Molatlegi from Kosachi. I've got a specific questions for you, Itumeleng. Two, actually. One is, what are the opportunities and what are the risks for labor in a professionalized public sector? And also that a professionalized public sector is going to demand greater performance from its members and may just link greater rewards to greater performance. And what would be labor's approach to that? And you're more than welcome to speak to the issues around the ruling party because you're much more closer to them than Shan over there.
Yeah, no, thanks. Thanks for the opportunity, Palesa. And you see, what is interesting about this whole topic, which I must take from where you started, before I come to the issue about human resources and the performances. You asked a very critical question when you started. In your ending speech, you said, what will it take to make the reform work? And if I can just answer in 2 words, a strong state, then I think we can all go home. But again, the next question we say, can a state be independent of politics? Because I was listening to these narratives that are coming. Of course, the answer is no. Because by its nature, a state is a vehicle that advances the interest of a dominant society, a dominant class in society. So if at any given time, the dominant class in society is that of capital, then the state of its role in essence inherently to advance that interest. And that is why you find strict and difficult contestations within the state. And I think that in itself informs our alliance with the ruling party. Because the alliance is not only for us to be close to the ANC, is to be able to control, to have influence in the state apparatus, in how the state operates. Because remember, we are at a point as workers where our operation is inherently to service the citizenry of South Africa. And within that broader context of the citizenry of South Africa, there's quite a number of anomalies that have developed. One is over the years, the modus operandi, the policy choices that the state has taken. And those of course, choices were politically and economic in nature. And they got transferred into the public discourse. Now it is for us to be able to have the historic context. And I think all of us in this room, we are aware about the political and the historic context that cannot be divorced from this process of professionalizing or the reform in public service. For what it is, every time there's a new sheriff in town, the sheriffs would want to clean up and assert their own policy preferences. And that's what is happening. For what it is, remember, the ANC has been moving through some phases. And one of those phases was where we are now is to clean itself up from its internal cancerous decay. Whether who was responsible for that is not a point for debate now. But the fact that the cleaning has to happen, it inherently affects the workers. And ourselves as COSATU, we are all there to ensure that there's going to be more cooperation in the way that policy trajectory is going to be executed. For an example, I was just reading one study to say, pre-1994, the size of public service was about 1.2 million workers. And we were servicing about 47 million South Africans. Fast forward to where we are now. The size is 1.3, and we're servicing, we've grown about 12 million. So that in itself, it tells you the diversity of the demand within the public service. So to professionalize it, one of the things that I think we agree with Minister Senzo is that the public service is not bloated. And in that context, I think there's also international research that tells us that when you check into the population versus human resource, that ratio, we are well below as a developing country, which aspires to be in a developed country state, because our economy is that of a developed country, yet we are a developing economy. We are, so there's a lot of disparities. Over the past 20, 25 years, we've not seen the growth in the public sector. So one of the questions that will say, no, but we've got a lot of public sector servants that are not productive at the workplace. In actual fact, the rhetoric should change to say, have we reinforced and increased the capacity of the public servants to be able to match the growing demands of society? And the answer is, of course, no. Statistically, it says no, and comparatively, it will say international standards, no. So that's one of the things that when we talk about the reform, that the key thing is that we indeed need an increase in the number of public servants. And I'll tell you the narrative that will come. There's a concept of course, you are aware of the Washington Consensus. One of the key economic consensus that over the years, about 20, 30 years, that narrative wants to assert the state to be a smaller state that is a free market enterprise approach that does not have strong institutions. So what it means that let the external forces, the business environment, begin to control the state. And like when I started in the open, I said, no, a state becomes a vehicle that advances the interest of the dominant class.
Okay.
So within that context, there's a greater debate that goes to say, how then do we move into the professionalization? Of course, we're going to look into the skills profile. And in my view, I still believe that South Africa, the demands of society in South Africa against the skills profile that we have. Of course, there's the statistics that say about one third of the public servants are not qualified. So professionalizing it is not to divorce it from politics, but to find a buffer between how then do we neutralize. Because the institutions of the state institutions by themselves has to be independent. But we cannot sit here and begin to think that we can divorce ourselves from the political influences. Because for whatever it is, the electoral system assert politics into the whole frame of the public sector, the whole system itself. So it is in that context that our argument comes and begin to talk into that space. And lastly, if I have to deal with the issues, actually the 2 points that I want to deal with as a historic context. The pre-1994, there's what we call the sunset clauses in our constitution. That in itself asserted the hegemony of apartheid to continue post-apartheid system and within the economic context. And that is why even when we talk about ensuring that public sector it becomes too strong, it gets built economically, we have disinvestment happening in South Africa. The business world will sit on investment. No, I'm not ready to invest in the public service. I'm not ready to grow our own internal economy. It is for that reason that we could not politically get into the economic controls of South Africa. By their nature is that because of those settlements, the sunset clauses. And that's why it becomes very, very difficult. When, for example, when unions, we fight for increase of human resources, where government pushes austerity, where government would push, for example, what we call moratorium on vacant posts, non-filling of the vacant posts. I just gave you the statistics that our society has grown by so much, and yet the number has not grown. So it is a very difficult thing to expect a nurse. By the way, today's International Nurses Day. And myself as a nurse, I just reminded myself when I was still in those days when I was there that I would sit in a ward and be expected to take care of so many patients. Within that context, your professionalism will drop when you are overworked and begin to not be appreciated, because when the demand grows in my execution of job, as a person, I sometimes let the flag down. And you begin to see all this insinuations about public service workers that are rude and all that. It is as a result of a simple policy choice of not increasing the human capital in proportion to the growing societal needs. So
yeah, Itumeleng, that's interesting. I'll come back. I mean, I just want one last question for you, and then I'll take the questions from the panel. I mean, I hear your point, and I take your point around, you know, the proportion of the civil servants to the population. But what you're not talking about is about growing the economy, because you can't, you know, government is now saying, and rightly so, that the biggest item in the budget is paying the civil service. So it is actually a very an unsustainable item on the budget, that you are paying the civil service and you're not investing in productive capacity of the economy. So it's all well and good to say you need more civil service, but can we as a country afford to service a ballooning wage bill that is actually causing quite a big hole on the national fiscus?
Look, I think quite some few aspects needs to be put into context about this ballooning wage bill. For what it is, we're talking about the diversity of public service. That there are those of public servants that are employed under PSA, Public Service Act. And there are those that are outside of the Public Service Act that are dealt with by like the parliamentarians, your legislatures. Like, for example, we have a situation where one mayor has got the audacity and the right to appoint about 10 advisors. And there's no control at that level. But all of these people eat from the same public sector wage bill.
Yeah.
And the concentration would then be on only those that are employed under Public Service Act. You know, those that are level 1 to level 12 that we negotiate within the public sector. But we also have got ESCOM, for example, all those independent states that are also taken from the same wage bill. So by definition of a wage bill, we need to go deeper into who drains from the wage bill in itself. It's not just a narrative that says the wage bill is growing. Of course, there's quite a number of arguments that we can also throw in terms of growing the economy. And one of those, okay.
Sorry, there's a lot of questions on the chat group. So I'm going to take a few questions from and then, you know, I'm sure there will be questions coming your way and you can answer those. So you can raise your hand on the icon there, or I can just look at the question and answers and take questions from there. Okay. So let's see. I think Salman Diamonds is saying, I think the point regarding accountability that's being made by Shen now is very critical in public sector. I agree we need to look at means to ensure accounting officers are protected against political influence or bluntly put political bullying. And I mean, I don't know how we get around that because, you know, the experience over the past 10 to 15 years has been that, you know, you've got ministers are very powerful people in the system. So how do you, and you know, Shan, how do we make sure that we can guard against the power of the minister to hire and fire? You know, I mean, there is like, you know, there's a division between the DG and the administration and the political office, you know, and ideally it's there in paper. And I think you said that before. It's there, but, you know, it's the implementation of it. But because you really are dealing with a very powerful political party, you know, the Minister of Finance or the Minister of Public Service and Administration, just by being a minister, it's a very political, it's very powerful political space to be in. And how do you manage the bullying that comes with that power?
Well, let me say, in a kind of utopian world, we would have whistleblowing legislation that would empower even DGs and HODs and municipal managers, firstly to record all such instructions, and then to take it, whether it's the Public Service Commission or up to the presidency, who ultimately should be where the buck must stop with any of these kinds of issues. But I think if you read Mosilo's book and her own experience, it requires that I think as citizens that we need to be firstly recognizing that kind of work. We need to be appreciating it. We need to be applauding it. And we need to make their life less difficult than what it has been thus far. Yeah. So in a sense, I think the whistleblowing component is a huge part. And then flowing from that is the political and public sanction that must go with instances of that kind. And lastly, when issues like that occur, we should be at the point where I think in many other countries of the world, it leads to almost immediate dismissals of political heads. And that's what we need to be working towards, and getting all political parties to in fact gravitate towards. And they will only do that when that becomes a kind of societal norm for which there are political consequences if people deviate from it.
The other question is from Paul Hoffman. He's asking, and I think I'm just going to throw this question over to Kangi, and Shani, more than welcome to answer that question too. And he's asking, and I think it's a question that many people ask in South Africa around public service. He says, can the public sector reform succeed in the context of the pursuit of the national democratic revolution and in the light of the levels of corruption with impunity in South Africa? Cadre deployment and kleptocracy need to be eliminated via reform the criminal justice administration for the latter, and with better compliance with C195 for the former. Anyway, so he wants to know, can there be public sector reform in the context of the national democratic revolution? I actually don't know what that means, but that's the question to you, Kanki, and I suppose a question to Dumeleng as well.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I think the reform from where we're sitting, the intention is to insulate the administrators from the powerful politicians. You correctly indicated that politicians are very, very powerful.
Yeah.
And you cannot just, for example, change politicians because there are political considerations to do that. Even for the president to reshuffle, I'm sure that there are political considerations. But the intention is to try and insulate the DGs and administrations from the ministers. Hence, we supporting what the president has done to ensure that the ministers cannot fire and hire DGs. That becomes the prerogative of the president, because sometimes you get personality clashes because they want you to sign something and then you say no, and then you have to go. And that does not necessarily work. The challenge is that if you have the right president or the right premier, that can work. If you have the wrong president, then the country will be in a mess, because then the president may just use their powers also then to continue with the challenges. And I think we also then need to strengthen the whistleblowing, because whistleblowing is a very, as we have seen with people who went to the State Capture Commission and others, it's a very lonely journey. Most of the people who went out and blew the whistle are unemployed, are unemployable. No one wants to touch them because people don't necessarily even trust them. So we need to find a different way of strengthening this. Maybe even create a fund that they can continue with their livelihoods even post the whistleblowing. Because at the moment, anyone who thinks of blowing the whistle, they're thinking twice to say, firstly, my identity is not going to be forever hidden. And once it's revealed, then your life is also in danger. So we really need to find a balance and find a way. And I think also trying to insulate the public servants from politicians in SOCs and others. Our proposal that we also made was that the public servants, the DGs, the DGs, the CEOs of SOCs, they have to, at any given moment, implement the 5-year manifesto of any governing party. So if party A wins, the very same public servants must be able to implement, so that they should be able to comprehend and understand the politics of the day without breaking any law. So if party A wins, the same public servants do not be changed, because we've seen when party A wins in one municipality, the whole administration is changed, and that's why we have so much instability and audits opinions that are not favorable because of that change. And then you can also create fear, because those ones who are left there, they become easily bullied, and they can sign things that they're not supposed to sign. So we're saying the public service that we're trying to build and professionalize, if they understand that if party A wins, we're going with party A's mandate, we're implementing that. If party B wins, so you can have a DG that is there for 15 years, but they're doing the right things. Unlike now, when there are just so many changes that affect the service delivery, because at the end of the day, it's about the delivery of the service to the people of the country and the voters. And if that is not happening, we will not going to go anywhere. We will end up having the situation that we have now, where majority of the people are not receiving services because the capacity of the state is also very, very weak to implement that.
Okay, I've got an interesting, Firoz Khan has got lots of questions, and Willie Hofmeyer, thank you for coming in, Willie, with a very interesting question there around lifestyle audits of senior civil servants or even senior politicians. Willie Hofmeyer says, in his experience, that it doesn't really work, the lifestyle audits of senior politicians or senior civil servants. So what do we do with that? Itumeleng Kangi Ashen, this is a senior former civil servant, and who says that the lifestyle audits don't necessarily quite work.
In my view, I think the issue is more about implementation of the policy, because once you do lifestyle audits, the question is, what do you want to achieve? But if at the end of the day you want to exclude those that are corrupt, to say, but how did you accumulate where you are now, or the way you live is not equivalent to your earnings, that in itself is more about implementation, accountability that is lacking within that space. And it's more to extend about the political choices. You see, the issue of cadre deployment, I think the context should be understood, that there are phases that we went through as the movement, as the revolution. And one of those was that in 1994, when we took over, we didn't go to any school to learn how to govern. So one of the things that you had to do was to surround yourself with it. But I think we're in the phase that we need to say we're getting out of it and to clean ourselves. And that's why we're welcoming this. And one of the things that are very succinct to this, the judiciary stood up and said personal liability as a policy. To say, once you make a wrong choice as a DG or ever in key position, and you are found to have been wanting, then you will be personally liable for that. So that's one of the ways of cleansing as part of consequence management. So, but what we say is that the review of the deployment policy to begin not only to say, not every cadre that gets deployed is illiterate, but that's the first part. And second part, most of the cadres that they need to know their loyalty. If your loyalty is to the work that you do over the interest that you advance, it's another thing. But if I must say just the last comment about the National Democratic Revolution that was raised, that is this professionalization in this context of NDR. Of course, I want to believe that, because remember, the motive forces of the NDR are the very citizens. So if I'm there and I'm the DG or whoever, I'm in high position, if I understand that the motive forces that put me there are the very people that I need to serve, and I'll be loyal to them. So I think that's the context which we need to bring this to. Thank you.
Okay. Itumeleng, there's another question. Okay, sorry, Shane, you can go ahead.
Yeah, no, I hear what Willie is saying, but I actually don't think that we've got sufficient implementation of lifestyle audits at this point in time to come to a conclusion that it hasn't been working. I mean, if I look at just some of the preliminary work happening at Transnet, you are beginning to see the implementation of this and some results. I think the key gap is that there is no common approach across the public service on how this needs to be done and who in fact must do it. So in the state-owned entity that I serve on, SAFPOL, we have had to now go out to one of the big auditing firms to in fact help design a system to do lifestyle audits. So I think that really is the key gap. But I think it is an instrument that has potential, and we can come to that conclusions, I think, only after we have really rolled it out on a sufficient scale. I wish Willie had been on the panel to talk about some of the work that he had been doing on the AFU, where not lifestyle audits, but similar tools to in fact put all the kinds of key people through lie detector tests on a continuous basis. And from the discussions with him, those seem to have yielded very good results. Now, there might well be opposition to some of those tools, but in that instance, they did work. Thanks, Palesa.
Thanks. Kangi, there's this interesting question here from Nomusa Sibia, and I think it's one of the key questions that we actually need to reflect on. And she says that not much emphasis is placed on competency levels of politicians as the decision makers, and I think it's true. And she says it's all good and well to have suitably qualified public servants, and I think we have many of those, but what about the politicians? And I think sometimes that's when the conflict is between a highly qualified, highly trained and well-accomplished civil service, and who has to account to a politician who is accomplished as a politician and not much else. So how do we deal with that? Kangi, maybe you want to take, you wanna try and answer that one?
Yeah, I think firstly we need to understand the context of where our political system come from. Remember, the majority of the people who are politicians are not necessarily career politicians. They did not train to be politicians. Most of them were forced by circumstances to be in politics because of the situation that was happening. So I think this is a passing phase. In future, you will find politicians who are highly educated. We've seen, for example, in the ANC and then in the EFF, we've got the politicians who've got masters and so on. So that is changing. I think as the older generation exits the environment, things will change. But in the meantime, we have to understand context that we're dealing with what we have. The system is producing what it has now. So it will be better at least to have the technocrats, because the technocrats are supposed to be advising politicians. They're supposed to be specialists. If we're coming with a policy or regulations on renewable energy, that should be the space of the technocrats. The politicians need them to check the political implications of whichever a proposal we're making. We cannot change it now as things stand, looking at the history of our country. But in future, that is changing. You've seen there are a lot of people. The premier of Northwest, not Northwest, the premier of Northern Cape is for the PhD. So people are going to school, and later it's going to be it's likely to be a requirement that for you to lead, you should have a certain qualification.
Qualification.
Yeah.
let's hope so. I mean, I don't want it to also become an elitist, thing that you gotta have an education to be a functional and highly qualified politician, but let's leave it at that for now. I just want to welcome Pali Lehohla, who is the former Statistician General. And I've got a question for you, Mr. Lehohla, is how the lack of reform translates into poor service delivery, and what, from your experience in your former job, how has that, what are the statistics on that?
The raw statistics in state institutions is very important because it constitutes an accountability framework, not about what has gone past, but in terms of projecting into the future. So you need this quantification framework to understand your patterns of spending and all that. What we see in government is the poor attention to evidence. And over the years, this poor attention to evidence has led to where we are. I would argue that it is the absence of that that has facilitated in many ways the porous way in which we have governed in South Africa. It is not the only cause, but its absence, it allowed the levers of power not to exercise that power in the way that it was supposed to be exercised. And I think that's the big problem that we have. I mean, if you take something like service delivery and you use statistics to look at how well this service delivery has been, you'll realize that where houses are built, where water is built, and play that against the citizen satisfaction survey. The dispersion of levels of citizen satisfaction across different terrains of service delivery points to the absence of what you can call human settlements. Human settlements, when you measure human settlements and satisfaction, the tendency must be that they gravitate to the same center. But when they are so divergent, then you know that there's no service delivery, there's no human settlement objective being met. Instead, it's independent departments reaching out to deliver whatever they want to deliver, and they are not integrated. And the benefits, therefore, in those kinds of processes of those kinds of realities, patronage patterns that are being driven. So statistics is this framework that gives you a lens on what is actually happening and gives you concern where it is not happening that way.
Okay. Anthony, I've got a question here, and I think you would be the right person to respond to, from Ramateu Monyokolo, who says, it is the assumption that corruption is only at the level of accounting officers and executives. It may help to professionalize key strategic areas. Says National Treasury is targeting supply chain management of organs of state. That's what should be prioritized to protect state resources. The next area of professionalization is the employment of executives and managerial personnel. Do you care to give a comment on that?
I think there are several questions in there, and they're a little beyond my area of confident expertise. So I would rather not give a clear answer. I mean, other than to say that I think there is from the deliberations at the conference, that there were differences of opinions among the people in Treasury themselves about how to approach the problem of procurement and compliance. But I thought a broad skepticism that you could control a country like South Africa from the center. and that in fact that may have been one of the mistakes. I think one Treasury official talked about a reflex impulse to centralize and control that ultimately damaged the way in which the public service functioned. That there's an attempt to stop things being done that are wrong, and that includes centralization, for example, today of how the infrastructure spend is being run, but in the past, more broadly, the proliferation of regulations controlling how public servants can behave, and that's been damaging, and that there needs to be a balance, and that the broad philosophy should be to decentralize wherever possible. I'm not sure if that's an answer to your question, Palesa.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I think it's an interesting one because I think Ramateo is saying that National Treasury is targeting supply chain management of organs of state, and you're referring particularly to SOEs, supply chain. I mean, I think that's where we found, and simply because SOEs play such a critical role. Or they play such a critical role in South Africa's economy, but also was a focus, as I said earlier on from that paper that I referenced earlier on, was that it was like a focal point of organized looting in many ways, and I think it makes a lot of sense to kind of focus on that as part of cleaning up. But I also wonder to what extent that focus should just be on that, or should, as part of the broader public sector reform, just basically look at supply chain and procurement reform in totality. And I'm wondering, Kandi, if you've got anything to say on that. Kandi, are you still there? I think
I'm here. I'm here. I think the issue of procurement, public procurement, is a little bit complex, but there are various ways. The first one is that the public procurement is a very key and critical equipment or instrument to in a way ensure that there's change in South Africa in terms of the creating of Black business, women-owned business, youth-owned business, businesses owned by people with disabilities. So if you look at the triple PFA, which is the act that seeks to ensure that there's a preference in state procurement, the intentions are very good. The intentions are good because they understand that if you want to implement any transformation, there may be costs involved because you are trying to bring people into the mainstream economy, people who have been excluded by law, and that flows from the Constitution. With the Constitution, which says that there will be preference, and then the triple PFA is trying to implement that. So again, going back to the issue, the objectives and intentions are always good. The issue is always in the implementation. So in the implementation, you find that there are many other people that who have their own different agendas. Others want to abuse the legislation for their own intentions. We've seen it, for example, with the PPEs, where people, for some reason, they went to get some companies that are not registered with SAPRA. They are not registered anywhere. They get registered today. Tomorrow they get an opportunity. They get registered to do gardening, and then they get this opportunity. So that is not the intention. The intention of the laws are very good. The problem is the implementation of people by people, because they want to abuse the system. So we need to find a monitoring mechanism that discourages people who are abusing deliberately the systems that we have. So we need public procurement. We need public procurement legislation. We need to use it to bring people who have been excluded from the system. But we just need to monitor the corruption portion of it, because people are abusing it. And again, it comes back to what we're trying to do of finding ways of insulating the officials. Because if you are a DG or you're a CEO of an SOC, and then a political principal come and say, this tender must go to that person, you've got no way where you can go and report that that is credible enough that can protect you. You can say no, and then you get suspended, you get fired. So that's why we need to find a way of protecting those who are responsible for implementing this legislation, because they'll do it right, knowing that if I do it right, I'm protected. But if I'm not protected, the politicians are very powerful. They come and say, do 1, 2, 3. If you don't do it, you get suspended. If you do it, you are on your own when you go to commissions, because there's no way politicians are going to give you this thing in writing, so you can't record it anyway. They'll just call you to a meeting, a private meeting or a dinner, and say, but there's this issue that needs to be done. So we need to find a way. How do we then protect those people within that context? Because there's nothing in writing that will say that the minister will say, go and give this to A. They won't do that because they know that is evidence. But they can call you to a meeting and say, but this thing we think must go this way. So we need to find a way where then when a CEO or a DG is faced with that type of environment, what do they do? Because they've got kids, their kids are going to school, they've got bonds to pay, they've got cars to pay. It becomes very, very, very tricky. But we need state procurement. We need to use it to transform the country, the economy of the country, and then to bring new entrants into the economy, so that we can also reduce the structure of the economy. If you look at the structure of the economy, is basically a monopolistic type of structure, because each and every sector is controlled by the big 3, the big 4, the big 5, who control 95% or 90% of the economy. So we need to utilize the state procurement to change that structure to at least maybe 60-70.
Okay. Yeah, thank you so much, Kangi, for that. We've got about 8 minutes left, and at this point, I think I'm going to try and pull this conversation back together again. We've spoken a lot about procurement. We've spoken a lot about how to protect or insulate public servants from the power of political influence. We've also talked a lot about how to build capacity of the public service, and then leading up to professionalization. I want Professor Ivor Chipkin to come in and pull it together and tell us, how he sees this process moving from here on. Chip, is over to you. Sorry, Professor Chipkin, is over to you. Not
so thank you very much. I'm not Professor Chipkin, so I think I prefer the title "Not Professor Chipkin," which is more appropriate. Lisa, thank you very much. Thank you for this conversation. I think it's been very, very exciting. It's the first of its kind that I've really participated in, this bringing together these various sectors to talk about reform. What Palesa hasn't mentioned to you is that she's sitting in Washington, and she woke up in the early hours of the morning to join us and to facilitate the session. So Palesa, thank you very much for getting up early and for your excellent facilitation of this discussion. Also want to thank Anthony Butler for the important role that he's played both in assisting and conceptualizing the conference, but also in summarizing the events here. Yellowwoods and Andy in particular for the IT platform, and to Vanya from GAP for helping administer the administration of this event, and of course to our panelists who helped stimulate a very interesting conversation. From GAP's point of view, this is the beginning of a series of events, and I think what's important about it is that The idea is to put back firmly on the political agenda, on the civil society agenda, on the unions and in the churches and in business sector as well, the importance of public service reform so that we can begin to think around the differences between us, but also the areas of commonality which we might be able to support around invigorating a larger campaign or project of reforming the state. It seems to me, and I think there's a wide shared agreement in this regard, that if it's not the most important issue facing South Africa today, which I certainly believe it is certainly one of the most important issues in South Africa today. It seems to me that South Africa cannot really advance any further than it is, or overcome the current crisis that it's in, without paying serious attention to what it will take to overcome the problems in the public service. And it seems to me what is very exciting about today is that three themes seem to emerge, which I think are very, very promising to take forward into further conversations of this kind. The first one is the large conversation around the kinds of internal changes that need to happen around procurement, around politicization, around the power of ministers relative to administrators, around the structure of the public service, the relative power of different parts of government, the role of the Public Service Commission, for example, in appointments, the role of the National School of Government, etc., etc. So there are a whole lot of quite technical and important key changes to be made in the structure of the public service. But I think what was also so exciting about today's conversation, and the point that Sean Bolton made, and I think it's absolutely key, is that actually the task is not as difficult as we tend to think. So this is not about rebuilding the state from the beginning. This is not about reimagining the state from the beginning. This is not about overcoming apartheid again. This is about restructuring and reorganizing the administration, which has, and I think we need to constantly remind ourselves, has tremendous potential and capacity already in place. Some of the reforms undertaken by Geraldine Fraser-Moleketi, which I understand is part of our discussion, some of those reforms are important and have succeeded. So we're not operating from a complete point of catastrophe. We are operating from a point where there is much opportunity and much scope to improve things from a position as they currently are. I think that's a very, very important one. And that goes back to this idea of the kinds of stories we tell ourselves and the stories we tell about government and the state which we have. So that's the second large theme. The third theme, and it was made by several people, but including in particular by Bishop Mpulwana, is the importance of citizens. That we need to bring back into the scenarios, not just the technocrats, not just the storytellers, but also you and I as ordinary citizens holding government accountable in the right kinds of ways. And that means for South African citizens to be actively involved in thinking about government and administration from a point of view of empowerment. So again, I think that's a third very, very important theme which has come forward in this conference. I think those three alone provide, I think, a framework for thinking about how to go forward around overcoming the current crisis which South Africa is in. GAP is in a very strong position. We've got a fantastic team of people with a great network around us. We're going to be holding several more of these sorts of events to try and build support for the idea of reform. It tends to be overlooked by sexier topics like economic transformation and economic policy. There tends to be a view in the general public that questions of public administration and government are, if you like, not sexy or dull or boring. They seem to me the absolute heart of the current matter, and we are determined to put them firmly onto the political and social agenda. On that note, I'm very grateful for everyone's attendance. We had a huge outcome. I'm amazed by how many people turned up today. I think we had nearly 100 people at one point. That's a fantastic outcome. So thank you to everyone who registered and who joined our conversation. And please be ready for more of these sorts of events. And on that note, Palesa, thank you again, and thank you very much.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, everyone, for coming, and have a good evening.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you very much.
You. Thank you. Bye.
Or what is happening?
Everybody, thank you so much for that, Palesa. Is Palesa gone? Anthony, Itumeleng, thank you so much for your participation. Very, very grateful to have had Cosatu involved. All right. Thank you.